So, welcome back. I'm now going to tell you what got me into the story of baking soda and excited about it. So I was sitting here at this table with my daughter who was studying university course and historical. Something popped up on YouTube, a story about a woman called Edna Boone. If you happen to get our book or you download it, you will find the story. You will find a video of her. This lovely lady was 100 years old. In Alabama, 10 years ago, they realized that they still had a few survivors from the Spanish flu. And they thought, we better get their stories before they're gone. So they interviewed them. She told her story. She lived in a little town called Madrid in Alabama. And when the flu came, everybody in her town got really sick. But her family did not. Her family nursed the sick. They cooked for them, they grew gardens for them, they took them to the doctor in wagons, those that survived, they buried the dead, and she said that her family did not get sick. She said, my mother, in the morning, would give them give us half a teaspoon baking soda in a glass of water. My father, my mother, my two brothers, twin brothers, myself, and we were the only entire family did not get sick. I often think that's what saved us, because we were the only family. So I was watching that, and Michelle watched it too, and I went, well, that's either coincidence or it's true. And I had to think about that, because you have to think about things like that. And then I thought, well, why did her mother have the idea of taking baking soda? So I started looking around to find out that kind of information. So, turns out that it was a thing that people did back then. They took baking soda as a drink, as a gargle. Now, during the Spanish flu days, in those days, doctors said, by whatever means, keep yourself healthy. They gave them lots of good advice about fresh air and keeping themselves separate, but fresh air and good food and keeping warm and gargling and baking soda and this kind of thing. And in the newspaper there were lots of remedies, ideas. There were, all kinds of remedies. What did they have? They had, I'll give you some names here. In my local newspaper in St. Catharines, they were advertising Bronco Grip at Walker's Drugstore, Palatol at Potter and Shaw, Panlock, Penix, who added sugar and water. Peps was for coughs, colds, and lung trouble. These things, I looked them up, weren't that bad. They had peppermint, eucalyptus, camphor, things we still think are good, but they were more like helping symptoms. And if something's good and it's still around, that's a sign that it's good. It's been around a while, good stuff, we still eat it. So these you can find in my backyard, probably in the, an old dump from the way they used to do things 150 years ago. But they're not surviving too well. What did they have back then? Well, they had their box of Arm & Hammer on the shelf. What do we have today? Got the same thing. Same thing. So, something to it. Still around. All the more important today, just people still use it. But what did they have in 1918? Well, what do they have now on the back of the box? What do they tell us to do? What's it for?
For cooking and cleaning.
Cooking and cleaning. Right. Nice list there of all the things it's good for. What did they have on the back of the box in those days? Well, I'm going to read it to you. You can have a quick look there. It said, take 1/4 of a teaspoon daily in the morning in water, or as prescribed by your physician. As a cleaning gargle, 1 teaspoon in half a glass of water, as prescribed by your physician. And what some physicians said, if you're surrounded by sickness, load up on it. Take more than that. Take half a teaspoon every 2 hours for 2 or 3 days. If you're surrounded by it, and then keep it going. This is the thing that Edna Boone's mother told them to do. She was reading her box. She had been to the big city before they moved to this little town, been to a women's club meeting. The doctor had been there, given health instruction. Somewhere in there, she got this information and started using it. Since 1950, Arm & Hammer's no longer allowed to say it's medicinal, it's not a drug, it's too simple to be a drug, and they're no longer allowed to talk about that. So, that is what Edna said. But what did Arm & Hammer say? Well, after the flu passed, their doctors from the Public Health Service, U.S. Public Health Service, I'm sorry I can't refer too much to Canada because I don't have the info yet, said that they observed this to be true about baking soda. So these are actually it's a nice little booklet. So back in the day, they used to send out these little pamphlets. So here's one about cleaning tips, housewife cleaning tips, cleansing tips. I think there's one there for motorists. And then, 1920, there was one, Arm & Hammer for colds and influenza. This is the first time they went out straight up and published something about health. They always had tips in there before, straight up. Now, this is such a precious little thing here that this is actually a photocopy because I've got one of the only ones that I know about in the world. It's photocopy. For the film, I should have shown you the real thing. But anyways, in it, a physician writes, in 1918 and 1919, while fighting the flu for the U.S. Public Health Service, it was brought to my attention that rarely anyone who had been thoroughly alkalinized with bicarbonate of soda contracted disease, and those who did, if alkalized early, would invariably have mild attacks. I've since that time treated all cases of cold, influenza, and the grippe by first giving generous doses, and within 36 hours the symptoms frequently would have entirely abated. Then he gives a little prescription, how to use it, and that was sent out to millions of homes because that's the way Arm & Hammer did everything. They thought that story was really important because they published it, I think, again the next year because it shows up in a different font. And then that story was really important. So they put together a pamphlet, 32 pages, and they set up a whole medicinal department. That doctor that wrote that note, they hired him. He was from Nebraska. And he had written in, and he believed in this stuff. And if you want to know the story about him, he was no shammy doctor. He was given an award in Nebraska for being the best doctor for preventative medicine. And he was willing to give that up eventually and moved to Connecticut, be out east, work for Arm & Hammer. And he spent the rest of his life, till 1952, working to promote baking soda. Tells you he thought there was something important, what he saw. And Americans, Canadians, British people, don't know who else. That seems to be the main realm of Arm & Hammer. People got used to using baking soda medicinally, and that may be why your grandparents talked about it, although they may not know the story came back from the Spanish flu. So, this is an interesting story. So our little footnote to this is you might wonder if this has any relevance to the present pandemic. They didn't know it was a virus back then. Now we know it's a virus. That virus, H1N1, and the present one, coronavirus, are both pH sensitive. They got to be in an acid environment to replicate and to go. So I think we should all think about that, and especially our medical people with authority, should be looking at that story from back in the past, because there are many, many accounts from doctors and people who the Spanish flu acted as a great trial. They got to try all these different things, and in the end, what did they say? They did say something. A lot of people died. It wasn't universal. That doesn't mean there wasn't something that worked. They wrote about it in articles, newspapers, medical magazines. They wanted people to know, and here we are today having the opportunity to get those stories out which have been hidden, but they have been found, to know about this great possibility. So I thank you all for coming here today, and I hope we can keep going with the power of baking soda.